welcome back. So today we are talking specifically about my boy Socrates. Uh, I love talking about Socrates because Socrates is he is the guy. Like especially in Western philosophy, like he is the guy. We've talked a little bit about we hadn't talked about necessarily the differences. We've talked about how there is a Western philosophy and an Eastern philosophy. We're going to get more into that over the next week or two, but I think it's important for us to talk a little bit more specifically about Socrates. I wanted you to be a little bit familiar with some of his quotes, some of his sayings, some of his beliefs before we talked about who he actually is or who he actually was. Because the thing is, there's a lot of controversy surrounding that. The biggest thing about Socrates is that he didn't write anything down. So everything that we know about Socrates is from secondary sources. One thing I like to do, pretty much, the way I like to teach is teaching through primary sources, but that's impossible when it comes to Socrates. Most of the assignments I give are based on the writings of, who was involved. But Socrates didn't write any of his own. Like he didn't write anything down. So what we know about Socrates is taken from mainly from Plato, who was Socrates' greatest student. The image you see right here, this is the execution of Socrates. Maybe jumping the gun a little bit here, but that is what we're going to talk about and discuss a little bit later on in class today is why and how, or this is more so tomorrow, I guess, but why and how Socrates was executed. Today we're going to look at some of his fundamental and foundational beliefs and why Socrates is considered the father of Western philosophy. All right, let's get started. All right, so on cue, the father of Western philosophy. So prior to Socrates, Socrates was born in 470 BC. People were more interested in how the world works in contrast to Socrates, who was more concerned with how people should behave. How the world works, this is essentially what we're talking about with science, and this is a large part of like what philosophy was up until this point. It was about how the world works, how the earth moves, how the earth rotates. Again, like a lot of this has been contradicted, re-theorized, and new information has been introduced over time. At one point in time, people thought that the universe was geocentric. Geocentric means that the Earth is at the center of the universe and everything revolves around the Earth. That would then lead to like Copernicus and Galileo in the scientific revolution, where they're talking about the universe being, or they were saying the universe, but really the galaxy being heliocentric, the sun being at the center of the universe, or again, as we've come to know the galaxy, because the universe consists of billions of galaxies. So this is, again, like what philosophy was before Socrates. It was about how the world worked. But Socrates was more concerned in how people should behave. Not that knowledge of how the world works is not beneficial, but Socrates was more practical. How could knowledge be used to gain a better life? And that's what Socrates was, his biggest concern is living the good life. And this would be kind of the influence on Plato and Aristotle, and so forth. How people should behave when we talk about that premise, that topic. We're talking about ethics, and this is one of the pillars of philosophy. There's 6 branches of philosophy, pillars of philosophy, however you want to quantify that or describe that. But there are 6 different themes of philosophy. One is logic, and that's what we've already went through. Number 2 is epistemology. Epistemology is really kind of what we're in right now. Talking about Socrates and the pursuit of knowledge. We've got a lot more to talk about when it comes to knowledge, when it comes to memory, when it comes to dreams, when it comes to reality. We've still got a lot to talk about there, but it's important that we go ahead and make sure that we knock out the, what Socrates was able to bring to the table in terms of epistemology, but not only in terms of epistemology, but also in terms of ethics. And that will be what we move on to, not next, but It'll be after that. So we're still a little away from ethics, but I want you to keep that in mind, how people should behave. The philosophers of Socrates' day were called the sophists. So the term Sophia means wisdom. Right up the road, there's a town called Wisdom. Well, not exactly. It's called Sophia, but you know what I mean. So the sophists, these were paid teachers. And before you start thinking I'm a sophist, maybe I am. I don't know. Maybe I am. Maybe that's my problem. Before you start calling me a sophist, however, I will explain that it's a little bit different in terms of being a paid teacher then and a paid teacher now. So a paid teacher then, these were the holders of knowledge, and the only people that could afford to attain this knowledge were the wealthy. So only the wealthy were being educated. So these teachers, like, they made pretty good money. You know, you've every single one of you have been in school for quite a long time now. You realize that school is publicly funded, so it doesn't matter whether you are wealthy, whether you are not, whether it doesn't matter what race, religion, creed. Like, you're subjected to an education. Again, like, we kind of take that for granted. I cannot. There's no kind of to it. Like, we definitely take that for granted, and I did too. Like, don't look to me as being someone that hasn't made mistakes and hasn't taken things for granted and forgot how good I have it. This is all kind of like this is all kind of a realization over, like, since my high school career ended. You realize when you're sitting at graduation, like, I've heard people say this before and after. So this isn't like I'm special or anything, but there is this, like, realization when you are at your high school graduation, and it's like, oh crap, I wasted a lot of time doing stuff that did not matter. It's like an epiphany almost. I remember having that at my high school graduation, and I realized, man, I got to get stuff together. And it took me a little bit. I didn't graduate with a very high GPA, and that was my fault. I was just lazy. I put my attention elsewhere where I should have put it in school. Happens that way sometimes. I got to move my camera just a little bit. There we go. Happens that way sometimes. I'd like to say that as soon as I got to college, I was this, like, straight A student and on top of everything, but I wasn't. Like, it took me a little bit of time, and I had to, like, kind of like hit a rock bottom before I could, like, turn that around. And not even saying that it's not. It's definitely I definitely have my struggles today too. So yeah, I'm no. A lot of you are much better high school student than I was. So what I'm trying to say is learn from my mistakes. Either way, let's get back to the sophists. So sophists were paid teachers. So the only way that you could gain knowledge is by paying these teachers to essentially grant you knowledge. And so Socrates had a problem with these people because they had this, like, sense of authority that Socrates didn't agree with, didn't believe in. He didn't believe that knowledge was something that you could just buy. It's not something that should only be attained as means to an end. So, like, you shouldn't just want to go to college to, like, find like a high paying job. Like, no, you should, like, if you want to go to college, like, you should go to college to, like, gain college for knowledge. Yeah, that's what you should do. You should go to college for knowledge. But, like, that is essentially, like, what Socrates is saying is, like, the pursuit of knowledge should be, or the pursuit of knowledge should be pursued for its own sake. Essentially, like, knowledge being, like, what Socrates called the one true good, and the one true evil being ignorance. So Socrates did not view the sophists as being wise. Yet we do use the word Sophia for the term wisdom today. And that's why the sophists were called, that's why they called themselves that. Like, they were essentially known as the wise. But Socrates didn't see it that way. So let's take a look. So what do we know about Socrates? So we know already that Socrates doesn't really care for the sophists. Socrates cares about wisdom, and he cares about the pursuit of knowledge, but he does not care about the sophists, the ones who believe themselves to be wise. So, what do we know about Socrates? Well, one thing we've already talked about with Socrates is he did not write anything down. This makes it incredibly difficult for us to tell what Socrates actually said and what people just attribute to Socrates. Some of the we have to imagine. So, everything that we know really about Socrates is written by Plato. Plato was one of the greatest writers in, I mean, time. He's one of the greatest writers of all time, because he could paint a picture to where you think that you know exactly who Socrates is, based off the writing of Plato. But in actuality, we don't know if that's entirely who Socrates was, or if that's just who Plato made him out to be, or if even some of the ideas that Plato attributes to Socrates are even Socrates' ideas in the first place. So it makes it an interesting contrast. Um, what else do we know about Socrates? Well, we know that Socrates lived in Athens, Greece. Again, he was born around 470 BC. He lived to about the age of 70, so that takes us to about 400 BC. We know that he had a wife, he had children. He never really had much money. He didn't grow up in a wealthy family. He did not. There's really a lot. There's a lot, I guess, that people have tried to figure out, and how did he even make money? How did he even work? Some say that he worked as a stonemason here and there, just as his father had. Some believe that he never worked, instead just devoted his entire life to philosophy, which, uh, in the mind of Socrates, this is the greatest pursuit that you could be on. But if your goal is to make money, and to be wealthy, that's not a good way to achieve that goal. We also know that Socrates served in the Athenian army. So he had military experience, which is pretty important because military experience, especially in these days, it was essentially it wasn't just you can sign up if you want to go into the military, you can. You don't have to. This was more so it was not forced. What was the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word off the top of my head. It's going to come to me though. But compulsory. Compulsory. There we go. You had to. Just like how you have to go to school, you had to be in the military.
Hey, you got that?
Let me pause this.
You got a Zoom in already?
I was recording something.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you good? You good?
I'll come back later.
You good? Okay. Okay.
I don't know about you.
All right. All right. No problem. Sorry. Let's see. So, serving the Athenian army, may have served in the Senate of Athens. Again, this gives him government experience, military experience, and government experience. This is where a lot of presidents have gained their qualifications to become president. They have been leaders in the military, and then there's also been leaders in government prior to running for president. So that the amount of not only just experience that helps in that position, but the wisdom that comes with it, because those are two high conflict areas of communication, two high conflict areas of life. I guess that's just the simplest way to put it. What else do we know about Socrates? We know that he went to trial and was sentenced to execution by the Athenian government for impiety. Impiety means not worshiping the correct gods or denying the correct gods. Again, we have to remember that this was polytheistic Athens. So polytheism, we're talking about multiple gods. Monotheism, we're talking about one God. Socrates did believe in some type of divine presence, but he did not necessarily believe in the gods that the Athenian government deemed, to be worshipped. And so Socrates went to trial and sentenced to execution by the Athenian government for impiety and for corrupting the youth of Athens. Education, again, not just education, but just the fact of the youth being the next building block to the future. That's been an important part of any really successful civilization for as long as there's been civilizations. It's the current generation's job to set up the future generation. And then if everybody does that, again, things should continuously get better and better, at least living wise. Um, hopefully in many different areas of life. Socrates had the ability and had the chance to escape execution, but Socrates decided that he cannot go against his own principles. And this is what we need to remember about Socrates for the moment. We're going to learn more about Socrates in Plato's writing, and when we get into a little bit of his beliefs. So let's look at Socrates and Plato real quick before we get into the beliefs of Socrates or or like how Socrates was influential. So Socrates was a teacher of Plato. At the time, Plato was a playwright. Plato, the playwright. So what do you think he's doing as a playwright? Well, he's writing stories that are acted out, tragedies, comedies. That is essentially what Plato is doing. He is writing out plays to be acted out. But after the death of Socrates, and again, Socrates was somewhat of a mentor to Plato. Plato decides to devote himself strictly to philosophy. The Last Days of Socrates by Plato. I meant to bring it in today, but I left it at home. I have the book, and it's a series of collections that Plato wrote. I'll just like all put into one book, and this outlines the death of Socrates. So um, what you're reading today is just a small piece of that work. Plato's most famous work is titled The Republic, and it is based on the political beliefs of Socrates. But I will say this, because I do want to make sure that I'm touching like all bases. Uh, Others argue that it doesn't necessarily reflect exactly Socrates' beliefs, and this lies the problem with Socrates because he didn't write anything down. We have to kind of take Plato's word for a lot of it, but how can you tell what is actually Plato's and what is actually Socrates? Because Socrates is the main character in every work by Plato. So, uh, so how do you discern the two, or how do you like not get them mixed up and not get their beliefs kind of intertwined in the process? It's a good question, and that's a question that we still have to ask and try to answer to this day. The Republic, again, probably the most well known and again probably the greatest work of Plato, was highly critical of democracy. Now, some believe that Socrates was not as critical of democracy as Plato. Um, but it makes sense why Plato would be weary of democracy. So let's read this next part. So the power of the majority, and this was both somewhat reiterated through Socrates, but again, a lot of people believe that, well, Plato definitely has problem with democracy, but both in some regard believe that the power of the majority and whatever most people thought, like that doesn't make it good in of itself. Just because most people think something does not make it good in of itself, because people choose things that are illogical and that are bad for them, and that cannot. They choose premises, they choose conclusions that cannot be defend. There is no defense for them. So therein lies the issue. If you know people can make illogical decisions, and if if everyone, not everyone, but the majority of people are making an irrational decision, well, then obviously you shouldn't go with that decision. But that is what democracy does. Democracy is all about the majority. That's why we actually have an electoral college in this country. So we're not like our founding fathers were very worried about what they called tyranny of the majority. This is James Madison. This is the Federalist Papers. This is like the founding, not just like the founding documents, but this is the in the what influenced the founding documents like of the Constitution. And like that all goes back to the time of like Socrates and Plato. Because here's the thing, like James Madison, he wrote under a pseudonym, so like a fake name, called himself Brutus. And so he's writing as Brutus, so people don't know that it's him. Was a senator from the days of Athens. And they're talking about essentially the two different like theories behind American government, that of a democracy and that of a republic. So why was Plato so critical of democracy? Socrates, and we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow, but Socrates was sentenced to death by a democratic government, by the majority. The majority of people thought Socrates was, again, impious and was corrupting the youth. But um, obviously Plato didn't believe so. Plato thought that Socrates was doing a good thing, and just Socrates just was not well liked, and because he wasn't well liked, he was charged up on false accusations and was sentenced to death. But in order for Socrates to essentially like escape that death sentence, he had to admit what he did not agree with, and so Socrates, again being a man of principle, goes through the execution. And we'll talk more about that tomorrow. Lastly, in terms of Socrates and Plato, Socrates being the mentor of Plato is influential in the philosophy of Platonism. Platonism. That is what we're talking about. Essentially the philosophy of Plato. We see this become the foundational beliefs of Western philosophy. And this is one of the key differences between Western and Eastern philosophy. Eastern philosophy, there is really not much discernment. There's not much difference between Eastern philosophy and Eastern religion. In Western philosophy, like there is a divide there. There is a divide in Western philosophy and Western religion. Western religions, we typically are talking about Judaism and we are talking about Christianity. In Eastern religions, uh, you do, I guess Islam kind of finds its way into both. It being an Abrahamic religion, having that in common with Judaism and Christianity, but at the same time having some of the collective ideas of Eastern religions, such as Hinduism, such as Buddhism. Buddhism as a religion, though, is again a little bit different. Same with Hinduism; they're a little bit different because of just the way that Eastern philosophy is more collective than individualized, and we'll talk more about that as we go on. But some of the key components of Platonism is the fact of an eternal universe that is like not bound to time. Eternal means forever, so it is not bound to time. The immortality of the soul. Plato speaks very much of the soul, and this is why, again, like philosophy and religion are very much intertwined. More so in Eastern philosophy, but like there's definite. I mean, there's a lot of common similarities and key talking points between philosophy and religion, even in the Western side of the world. The immortality of the soul and the existence of the divine, so something greater than um, what we can actually like what is here, like something that is larger than we are. And these are again the foundational beliefs of Western philosophy, and because it is also the foundational beliefs of Western philosophy, it also finds its way into Western religion. And so, for now, keep that in mind because we're going to revisit the cave. I had you guys kind of look at the cave and become familiar with the cave. We're going to do a little bit more reading on the cave and kind of find out what that parallel, what that story is trying to teach us. Lastly, let's look at what Socrates is most known for. So, this is how he influenced further philosophy or further philosophers. First is the philosophy of logic. This, not necessarily is only embodied by Socrates. He's probably not even the most well known when it comes to logic. That is more so Aristotle because he writes out a lot of the rules. But the idea that we must make logical decisions and that we must reason and we must ask questions. This is very much found in the philosophy of logic and just kind of the general way of being of Socrates. As we discussed up at the first term, logic is a pillar of philosophy. And again, we are questioning the validity of a claim. Um, you know, very many Athenians, many Athenians believed that Socrates was somewhat of a genius, but somewhat of a fool. And this kind of reflects that paradoxical nature that we've been talking about. We looked at personal experience with paradox. We looked at some popular paradoxes about how, like the harder, the more likely you are, excuse me, the more afraid you are to fail, the more likely you are to fail. Well, that doesn't make sense. That's illogical. Socrates was very much aware of this nature, that things can be very illogical yet be true, and things can be also logical and untrue. So uh, Socrates is about gaining wisdom and asking questions. And so much of the writing that you see by Plato, when Socrates, again, is the main character in his dialogue, he's just asking questions. This is both what makes people look at Socrates as a genius and a fool during his time. This series of asking questions is essentially what we call the Socratic method. The Socratic method is a form of cooperative argumentative dialogue by differing parties. So the way this works is that people are not necessarily beholden to exactly what thing, but they argue in the on behalf of an idea or an ideal. This is what we see that like lawyers do. Like, you know, a a successful lawyer, a successful attorney should be able to argue on behalf of their client, no matter who their client is. And that is because like they have to use this type of like Socratic argumentation where they are able to, again, like present a claim and then present reasoning to back that claim. It doesn't just happen with like lawyers and attorneys. Like you see this in like sports, like you see this in business. Uh, sports, for example, like, I look at like teams trying to trade like one player to another team. Like you have to kind of talk your player up to get the most out of them. So you have to be able to like take a claim, take a side, and then provide reasoning behind that. Now, the Socratic method, while it is again that argumentative nature, the problem is broken down to a series of questions, and that is to like eliminate contradictory statements. So like if you're trying to figure out, let's look at like what is the best food. Okay, well you have to set parameters into like what is the best food. And so you might have one person arguing that pizza is the best food. You might have one person arguing that I don't know, sushi is the best food. I just chose my two favorite foods. And so then to like figure that out, it's like, okay, well, what are we considering a food? Are we considering like are we considering like the best food to be like part of a meal? Are we considering it to be like, can it be a dessert? Can it be like an appetizer? Does it have to be something that's cooked? Can it be something raw? Again, like those are just some of the parameters that have to be set. But then, to say that, you're going to, let's try to think of another example to where we're looking at contradictory statements. So, this more so happens when we're talking about more, less trivial matters. Favorite food, that's something that, may not be, that's going to be subjected to a sense. But what if we're looking at like, okay, is there a God? Like that is the question that people have been trying to find the answer to since the beginning of time. And again, like different time periods predict and project different ideas. And so, is there a God? Well, do things happen for a reason, or does everything a matter of chance? Well, if everything's a matter of chance, then does life have any inherent meaning? Like again, this is how we break down into like a Socratic method, into Socratic questioning. It's like, how do we figure out the actual problem, and how do we like form a solution that can answer that problem, but maybe not always. Lastly, wisdom is related to ignorance. So Socrates again believed that anyone can access knowledge, but all they have to do is ask questions. That is what Socrates meant by "I know that I know nothing." He says the only way to gain true wisdom is to admit you know nothing and allow yourself to be curious and ask questions. Ask why. That's what you're told to do throughout your entire schooling, that's what your parents tell you to do. They say, look, if you don't understand something, ask why. Now, why would they ask you to do that? Because again, like if you have to ask why, then you are being receptive. When you are being receptive, that is how you gain knowledge. When people think that they know things, they tune out. I'll say this, like I'll be first to admit, like that I do that. I know that's got to be uh, bothersome for my wife. She's trying to tell me something, and maybe it's something that she knows more about than I do. But when I act like I know everything, I stop listening. And when I stop listening, I stop learning. When I stop learning, that's when bad things happen. I believe when you stop being receptive, not just receptive to like people, but like to things around you, like events happening around you. You have to pay attention, and if you're not paying attention, um, what's really going on. I think that's how sometimes we can like lose grip of reality is when we stop paying attention. Maybe we can pay attention too much. I don't know. I don't believe that Socrates would say that we can pay attention too much. Um, is Socrates the greatest? Uh, is he the greatest to look at in terms of like how to live a good life? Well, I think that's what philosophy is about. Is about kind of asking that question and attempting to find an answer. All right, so appreciate you guys. I will talk to you tomorrow. See you.